It is no longer good for anything to be thrown out and trampled by men. In that verse, the Lord summarizes the function of believers in the world. You could summarize it in one word, and that word would be influence. Influence. Wherever you are, and whoever you are, wherever you are, according to the Beatitudes that precedes this particular verse, you are going to function in the world as salt and as light. Christians, consciously and unconsciously, they are affecting other people, either for good or for bad. Somehow, when we think about a person who is a good person, who is solid, who is useful, a person who everyone thinks well of, we usually say about that individual, they are the salt of the earth. And by that we mean that that person really is an influential person, a very good person. But you know, everybody has an impact for good or for evil. Everybody is contagious. Whether you want to be, whether you don't want to be, it's just the way it is. You are a contagious person. You affect people by your attitudes. You walk into a room, and if you're down, chances are that the room may go down. If you're up, I played racquetball with a fella in Goshen, Indiana. I was in Rotary with him. We were good friends. 3 of us played racquetball all the time, 3 or 4 days a week at lunch hour. When John walked into a room, that room lit up. When he was present at Rotary, you knew John was there. When he was on the racquetball court, you knew he was there. Unfortunately, John one day played racquetball, slid down the back wall, had a heart attack, and passed. But you knew who John was, and you knew that he was a very contagious person. Robert Shannon tells about the Canadian had a plan to make a national park out of Ellesmere Island, which is the northernmost place on the continent of North America, about 480 miles south of the North Pole. It was a controversial park. The reason is permafrost is so fragile that if you step on it and make a footprint, it will last for a decade. And that's why our government doesn't want to do any drilling up there, I guess. That sounds a little bit like Longfellow when he said this: lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing serve or leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. Well, on Ellesmere Island, a person truly makes a footprint that's lasting, but you know, in the larger sense, all of us leave a footprint. Some of our footprints last for a decade, some last for 50 years, 100 years, some may even last forever. There's a little clock in the window of a jeweler store that one day stopped just a few minutes before 8 o'clock. School children on their way to school looked at the clock and thought they had plenty of time, so they stopped to play. Secretaries hurrying to catch a bus looked at the clock that had stopped and thought they had plenty of time, and so they slowed their pace to catch the bus. Businessmen looking at the clock saw that they had some time on their hands, so they stopped and they talked to each other. All because they were late, all because of one little clock that stopped in time. You know, you're the clock in somebody's life. Your faithfulness or your failure to be true to your convictions and your principles will influence other people to either grow and continue to be strengthened, or on the other side be defeated in their life. You have a tremendous influence. Jesus said it a bit differently in the text for today. Let me read it again. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. The text implies here a positive Christian attitude. Salt is something that cannot be ignored. You can't do it. It's a positive quality. If it's present, you can't help but recognize it. If it's absent, you certainly notice it. Margaret Runbeck said a person leaves all kinds of footprints when they walk through life. Some you may see, like their children, like their house, like the car they drive, but others are invisible. The prints that they leave on an individual's life by the words they say, the stories they tell, the jokes they tell, the gossip that they give, or the encouraging word that they give. A person doesn't think about it very much, but everywhere you go, everywhere you pass, you leave a mark on people's lives. John Powell said, our lives are shaped by those who love us, and it's shaped by those who do not love us. It's a powerful statement, isn't it? Think about the people that you've heard stories about on TV or read in books that no one seemed to love them, no one seemed to care. It affected their life. On the other hand, people come on TV and say, my parents loved me, everybody seemed to love me, and what a positive influence they became. A Christian ought to be identifiable in his influence. Now, often that positive Christian influence will last a long time. You don't know how long it's going to last. Let me throw a name out, Edward Kimball. How many people know the name of Edward Kimball? He's not well known to most people. He lived more than 100 years ago. He was a Sunday school teacher in Boston. And on one occasion, he taught young teenagers, and on one occasion, a young man from the country, we might call him in Tennessee a country pumpkin. Country pumpkin walked into his Sunday school class. He didn't know much about city life. He didn't know much about church life, but he came to class. When the teen came into class, Kimball reached him a Bible and asked him to turn to the Gospel of John. He didn't know where John was from Revelation or acclamation. He didn't know what he was talking about. The kids around him began to snicker, and Kimball saw the problem, and he took the Bible and turned it to the Gospel of John and reached it back to the young boy. He had the students read, and when it came time for the country pumpkin to read, it was obvious he struggled with reading. But Kimball saw in this young man some positive potential, possibilities. And so he worked with him. And after some months, he went to the place where this young man was employed, went into the back room where the young boy was stacking boxes, and he led this young boy to Christ. And that was the beginning of the ministry of D.L. Moody, this continent's greatest preacher in the last century. You didn't know Edward Kimball. He's just an obscure Sunday school teacher. What am I? I'm just a Sunday school teacher. Oh no, you're a Sunday school teacher who has power and influence. This young man's life was transformed because of the salt in Kimball's life. Godly people have great influence. You know, the presence of a godly person in a room can cause the devil's work to stop. Sometimes sin will be ashamed to show its ugly head in the presence of a person who demonstrates purity. I used to go to barber shops. I don't do that anymore. I go to beauty shops. But when I went to barber shops, I would sit in the barber shop waiting for my turn, and conversation in barber shops, if you remember, wasn't always the nicest conversation. There were foul language passing around, and sometimes a story would float by that wasn't a good story. And I never made a deal out of being a pastor. I'd get in the chair and start talking to the barber, and somehow it would come out in the conversation that I was a pastor, and you can't imagine what came over that barber shop. The bad language stopped, the stories stopped. Why? Because salt has a flavor in the life of a person. Jesus is telling us that Christians are not to be mere moral minus signs, not to be harmless non-entities, not to be uninteresting people, but we are positive influences that are recognizable in society, just like salt is recognized on an egg or a tomato. You may like them, you may dislike them. You may love them, you may hate them. You may fight with them, or you might fight for them or against them. But you can't ignore them. Jesus was like that, you know. Jesus had some people that absolutely loved him. Some people hated him. Some people wanted him dead. But he could not be ignored. I have always enjoyed working with wood. I'm not good at it, but I like doing it. It's a release. I had wood shops in Goshen, Indiana. I had a wood shop in Anderson, a little room in the garage. I had a wood shop in Jacksboro. Half of my garage is filled with woodworking tools that are not working right now. But the nice thing about a wood shop is that when you go in it, you recognize it's a wood shop. Not by the tools, but by the smell. You can smell the wood long after it has been cut down. Oh, when it was alive, you could smell the fruit maybe or the blossoms on it. But when it was cut down, you could still go into a room where wood was and you could smell the wood. A life can be like that. We can have an influence while we're living, and our influence will continue after we've been cut down by death. You are a contagious person, either for good or for bad. The text implies a salty characteristic. You are the salt of the earth, the text says, and that implies that the Christian is commissioned to carry out the characteristics of salt in his living. When Jesus was living, the people in his day connected salt with certain special qualities. One of those qualities that they connected it with was purity. Its glistening whiteness, I suppose, caused people to think of it as something that was pure. So if the Christian is to be salt of the earth, that believer is to be an example of purity in his lifestyle. One of the characteristics of our society is that it is always seems to be lowering its moral standards. The standard of honesty, the standard of diligence in work, the moral standards, they all seem to be lowered today than they were. And if we're going to be a strong influence in this society, we're going to be salt on the earth, then you must be a person who will hold high the standards and the purity in speech and in conduct. For you see, if you're a Christian, there's no discrepancy about that. You're honest. You say something, you're honest about it. You can be held to that word. You are diligent in your job. If you're not diligent in your job, don't claim to be a Christian there, for goodness sakes. You have moral standards that are far superior than the society in which you live. They're biblical standards. During a church service, a man stood up to testify one day about how he came to Christ. He said, 6 months ago, I selected a man in this congregation, a church member, that I was going to watch and scrutinize. Watched him closely at church. I watched him in his business life. I watched him in his social life. And by systematic inquiry from other people and personal observation that I made, I subjected that man to 6 months of microscopic scrutiny. And he ended his testimony by saying, I thank God for that man because he stood the test. And I was convinced to become a Christian myself. You don't think you have influence? Salt is also one of the finest preservatives. When I was a boy in West Virginia, I went out one time and watched them shoot a hog in the middle of the head, drag him up around where there was a big fire and a big barrel that was hot scalding water, and I watched the whole process as they put the hog in there, scraped him, cut him up. And then one of the things that they would do, because my grandparents did not have refrigeration, they would salt down the meat as a preservative to keep it from spoiling. Salt is a preservative. You and I are to be preservatives in our society. Christians are to be such an influence in society that we have a preserving effect upon it. And folks, we haven't done that well across this nation as Christians. Do you realize, and I believe, that Christians are responsible for abortion in this country and mixed marriages? Oh, you can't blame that on us? Why can't we? Christians by the millions stayed away from the polls in several of the last election. They were not salt in that situation. I don't care who they would have voted for. They needed to voice their opinion. I believe if we as Christians were the salt and the preservative of society, we could have stopped abortions. We could stop the misuse of marriage. I believe that firmly. We have not been the preservative in society that we should have been. Just as human nature has a bent to sin, society has a tendency toward being down in its social and moral standards. And the presence of Christ-like character in our world is an absolute essential if this world does not keep on disintegrating. We've got to stand up for what we believe and voice it. And I think I ought to get an amen. No nation is made safe because of its armies, its navies, and its air force. It is not made safe because of its government. It is made safe because of the character of the people that comprise that nation. Your godly influence will preserve society. Well, salt also gives flavor to everything that it touches. Without salt, food is yucky. Can I use that word? Yucky? Yeah. It's disgusting. I feel sorry for people who can't have salt on their food. In a very real sense, salt brings joy to the taste buds. Christ brings joy to the Christian. Some Christians act like they have no salt in their life. They have no joy in their heart. They have no joy in their soul. If you have joy in your heart and in your life, for goodness sakes, let your face know it. So the face can smile a little bit once in a while. Let people know that there's something in your life that causes you to smile. Sometimes we let our tasteless past, our mistakes in the past, we let those things, shortcomings, and our lack of witness affect our future joy. Christ brings joy. He wants a smile on your face. I read an interesting article this week about the Olympics that came from the Olympics. In the article, it said, despite the high stakes of almost every sport, one only needs to spend a few minutes watching women's volleyball to notice the simple method of staying positive. And the writer said, smiling. Smiling. Everybody give me a big smile. Smiling. That wasn't hard, was it? It said this, it's not unusual to see an athlete smiling during a competition, but any kind of happiness almost always vanishes after he or she has made a mistake and loses a point. Not only do they not smile, they sometimes throw rackets and do other things. But not in women's volleyball, the article said. After every point lost during the Olympic Games, volleyball competition, the women are always smiling. They're laughing. They're encouraging one another. And according to one NBC commentator, the idea is that once a point is lost, it's lost. There's no chance of regaining that point. And so instead, the women focus their attention on the next point, and the next point, and the next point, and ultimately winning the game. Now, that's quite similar to the way a believer is meant to deal with his confessed sin, for instance. Some people can't get over their sin. Rather than dwelling on the past, it's forgiven. God's taken it away from you. We need to look forward in our lives with hope and joy and smiling. The church needs that. The church needs smiling, happy, witnessing, contagious believers that will be salt of the earth in the communities in which we live. Thirdly, the text refers to a calamity. Verse 13, but what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? Can it be useful again? It'll be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Well, if a Christian loses his influence and he becomes ineffective, he becomes useless. He's like salt that's lost its flavor and just be thrown out. Now, there are some analogies that won't quite always match up with this, but when you lose your saltiness, you lose your usefulness in the kingdom of God. And uselessness and lukewarmness invites disaster. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 15 and 16, it says, I know all the things you do, that you are neither hot nor cold. I wish you were one or the other, but since you are like lukewarm water, I will spit you out of my mouth. Now, in Tennessee, we've had a lot of 90-some degree weather. And I used to, Jacksboro, have to go out and mow the yard in that weather and do work outside. And you wouldn't believe this, but I don't perspire. I sweat a lot. And my clothes would be soaking wet. Every piece of clothing I'd have on would be soaking wet. There was nothing better than a good ice-cold drink of water at those times. Now let's suppose Marge would bring me out a glass of water, and I take a sip of it, and it's lukewarm. Spit it out. Who wants to drink lukewarm water in that kind of a setting? Jesus said, sometimes my believers are like that. They're not hot, they're not cold, they're just lukewarm. And he says, I will spit you out of my mouth. As believers, we are to be on fire for God. We are to be useful in the kingdom. Now, this text also implies that Christians are given a commission. Jesus did not say that we are the salt of heaven. He said we're the salt of the earth. And he gives us the task of being salt in our community. Most professing Christians, and that's from the liberal edge to the very conservative fundamentalist edge, I think remain as spiritual atheists. Spiritual atheists. Do you know what a spiritual atheist is? Well, a spiritual atheist is somebody who just doesn't act like God exists. These wonderful computers do wonderful things, and right now it has done an unwonderful thing. Okay. A spiritual atheist thinks that the church is sustained by its services, that it is sustained by its fellowship, it is sustained by good feelings that you get if you come to church. That form of sentimentality has absolutely brought I think, a corruption to the church. We as believers are to stand up for all that is right, all that is moral, and all that is decent. There is a sign, a strange sign, in Vienna, Austria. It's translated from German. It says, "Welcome to Vienna, where the salt is in the salt shaker." Now, how stupid is that? Where is salt supposed to be? It's supposed to be in the salt shaker, of course. That's not what they meant. What they meant was they do not put salt on the roads in the wintertime when it snows. Now, the church should never make that claim, the salt is in the salt shaker. Salt in the salt shaker doesn't do any good. We are to be the salt of the earth. But we do no good if we stay put in the salt shaker. And many times during the week, we just want to stay in the salt shaker. Every one of us has an influence, negative or positive. A contagious Christian are to be live, they're to be contagious, they are to add flavor to people's lives. If you are truly a Jesus person, you cannot help but be salt in the world. If you're going to implement what Jesus said to do, you are going to influence people by being salt. Life Application Bible says this: as salt preserves and brings out the best flavor of food, so believers should affect others positively. It is a seasoning has no flavor. If it's lost its taste, it is of no value. Jesus said very emphatically to his disciples, and this word "you" is emphatic. It means simply my follower. You, my followers. Just not you, but you, my followers. If you want to be an influence in the world, then you have to live differently than the world lives. God would hold them accountable. And God holds us accountable. And you say, well, how do you do that? Well, there's a lot of ways. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 ways. One of them is, what phone call or what letter would you be willing to write to a person that the Lord would put on your mind about your feelings about them, your positive feelings, what you think they can become, and try to help them in a dark, decaying world? To whom in your neighborhood, in your family, in your workplace, in your school, could you be salt to? And yet he is reading me. And then in closing, you probably heard this one. You're writing a gospel, a chapter a day, by the deeds that you do and the words that you say. Men read what you write, whether faithless or true. Say, what is the gospel according to you? Are you salt? Or are you tasteless? Brother, let's sing this chorus. Just a moment, we'll prepare ourselves for a time of communion. Right now, let's sing this song and take it to heart.
Lord, lay some soul upon my heart, and love that soul through me, and may I humbly do my part to win that soul for thee.
You know, that's a great song. And yet, perhaps there's many Christians who never have a soul burden, a soul laid on their heart. I want to ask you to raise your hand, but do you have a soul that you're praying for their salvation? Do you have someone you long to see know Christ? Are you willing, when the opportunity arises, to be a verbal witness as well as a silent witness to them by your life? Just think what would happen in our congregation if each of us had a soul burden, and one person just in a year, we'd double our attendance. We'd have people being baptized. You're the church.